In this module, we explore emotional and social development in middle childhood, ages 6 through 11. Think of this period as a bridge between the imaginative, egocentric world of early childhood and the identity-seeking turbulence of adolescence. Right in the middle of that bridge, children are building the emotional and social architecture that will carry them through the rest of their lives. During this time, children move from the family as their primary social world into the broader worlds of school, peers, and community. They develop a more realistic sense of self, learn to regulate complex emotions, navigate friendships and social hierarchies, and build moral reasoning. As counselors in training, understanding this period is essential because many presenting concerns you will encounter, from anxiety to bullying to family disruption, have roots in these years. We will examine these developments through cultural, cross-cultural, and neurodivergent lenses, because development always unfolds within systems, cultures, and communities. By the end, you should be able to describe the major emotional milestones of middle childhood, explain Erikson's industry versus inferiority, and Kohlberg's moral development in a cultural context, and identify how ADHD, anxiety, and depression present during this period. You will also analyze peer dynamics, including bullying and social exclusion, and critically, apply cultural, cross-cultural, and neurodivergent lenses to your understanding. This last objective is particularly important. Much foundational developmental theory was built on studies of Western, white, middle-class populations. As counselors, we must think critically about how these frameworks apply, or do not apply, to the diverse children and families we will serve. Now we move into Part 1, Emotional Development. Picture a small plant pushing through a crack in concrete. That image captures emotional development in middle childhood. Children are growing in emotional complexity and resilience, but within environments that are not always supportive. During this period, children move from simple, inflated self-perceptions into a more nuanced, comparative, and sometimes vulnerable understanding of who they are. They develop more sophisticated emotional vocabulary, learn cultural display rules, and begin the lifelong work of emotional regulation. As you listen, keep your counselor hat on. What does it mean to sit with a 9-year-old who is realizing they are not the smartest kid in class? These are the questions we will explore. 2 foundational theories ground us here. Freud described middle childhood as the latency stage, where sexual and aggressive drives go quiet, allowing psychic energy to redirect toward learning and social connections. While Freud's theory has fallen out of favor as a standalone framework, his observation about this as a period of consolidation remains relevant. Erikson gave us a more useful framework. Industry versus inferiority. The central psychological task is developing a sense of competence. When children master skills, whether in school, sports, the arts, or social situations, they develop industry, confidence, and capability. When efforts are met with criticism, neglect, or repeated failure, they develop a sense of inferiority. Here, cultural context becomes essential. Erikson's concept of industry was developed within a Western, individualist framework where personal achievement is the gold standard. But in many collectivist cultures, including Indigenous, Latino, and Asian cultures, competence is not primarily about individual achievement. It is about contribution to family and community. In 2023, Cross and colleagues found that, among Indigenous communities, demonstrating competence might involve learning traditional skills, showing respect for elders, and participating in community ceremonies. So when we assess a child through the industry versus inferiority lens, we need to ask, whose definition of industry are we using? Self-concept is the answer to the question, who am I? For younger children, ages 5 to 7, it tends to be concrete and unrealistically positive. A 6-year-old might say, I am the fastest runner in my class, even if they are not. Their thinking is still tied to black and white categories, but between ages 8 and 11, a significant shift occurs. Children begin to engage in social comparison, measuring themselves against peers. A 10-year-old might say, I am pretty good at reading, but I am not as good at math as my friend, and I am kind of shy. Notice the complexity, holding multiple self-evaluations simultaneously and differentiating between domains. Culture shapes this process powerfully. In Western individualist cultures, social comparison focuses on individual ranking. But research by Hosseini and colleagues in 2024 found that among Native American youth, self-concept may center on collective identity and connectedness to peer groups rather than individual comparison, reflecting collectivist worldviews fundamental to many indigenous cultures. For neurodivergent children, self-concept is particularly complex. A child with ADHD may develop a self-concept organized around their differences. I am the kid who always gets in trouble, before having the language to understand those differences. Research by Powell and Bradley in 2025 shows that affirming psychoeducation, helping children understand their neurodivergence in strength-based ways, is critical to healthy self-concept. As counselors, we must attend to these diverse pathways to self-understanding. Self-esteem adds an evaluative dimension to self-concept. Not just who I am, but how I feel about who I am. Harder's model shows self-esteem is hierarchical, with overall global self-esteem at the top and domain-specific evaluations underneath, including academic competence, social competence, physical ability, and physical appearance. Physical appearance consistently ranks as the strongest predictor of overall self-esteem across cultures, with implications for how we think about media influence, even in middle childhood. However, cultural values moderate which domains carry the most weight. Consider Jalen, the case example. He is a Diné boy who creates beautiful beadwork, a skill passed down through generations. But at school, reward systems focus on reading speed and math fluency. His traditional skills are invisible. As counselors working within MTSS, how do we advocate for broader recognition of competence? For neurodivergent children, self-esteem is further complicated because children with ADHD and learning disabilities often receive negative feedback that erodes self-esteem in academic and social domains, even when they have genuine strengths elsewhere. Emotional development involves two critical capacities: emotional intelligence, the ability to recognize and use emotional information, and emotional regulation, the ability to manage how emotions are expressed. Cultural display rules are central here. These are unwritten social codes dictating when and how to show emotion, and they vary significantly across cultures. By age 7, children can distinguish between felt and expressed emotion. For children navigating between two cultural contexts, such as Indigenous children moving between their home community and school, mismatches in display rules can create real stress. A child praised for expressiveness at home might be reprimanded for it at school. For neurodivergent children, emotional regulation still looks different. A 2024 framework by Greaves suggests autistic children may develop different but valid strategies, relying on routines and special interests rather than social support. As counselors, we must avoid pathologizing emotional expression that simply differs from neurotypical norms. ADHD is one of the most commonly diagnosed neurodevelopmental conditions in middle childhood, affecting over 7% of children ages 6 to 11 in the U.S. It involves differences in executive functioning, inhibiting impulses, sustaining attention, following rules, and self-monitoring. Without support, children with ADHD face increased risk for poor school performance and secondary conditions like ODD. An important gender dimension. Girls with ADHD are frequently underdiagnosed because they more often present with the inattentive subtype. Girls may mask symptoms through social compliance, working hard to appear normal while struggling internally, often developing anxiety and low self-esteem by middle childhood. From a neurodiversity-affirming perspective, ADHD is a neurological difference with both challenges and genuine strengths, including creativity, hyperfocus, and divergent thinking. Research on the peers intervention shows meaningful social skills gains for children with ADHD, autism, and co-occurring presentations. Our job is not to make neurodivergent children act more neurotypical, but to help them understand themselves and advocate for accommodating environments. ODD and conduct disorder represent externalizing behavior patterns that become more pronounced during middle childhood. ODD involves persistent, hostile, defiant behavior toward authority figures. What distinguishes it from typical pushback is the frequency, intensity, and duration. Conduct disorder is more severe, involving disregard for others' rights across 4 categories: aggression, destruction of property, deceitfulness, and rule violations. Without intervention, it can be a pathway to antisocial personality disorder. We must bring our critical cultural lens here. Research clearly shows Black and Latino boys are disproportionately diagnosed with ODD and conduct disorder. This does not mean these children are more defiant. It means the same behaviors are perceived differently depending on the child's race. A white child who talks back may be seen as assertive. A Black child displaying the same behavior may be labeled oppositional. This is a systemic issue we must actively resist. Additionally, many behaviors labeled as ODD may actually be trauma responses. Children who have experienced ACEs, community violence, or intergenerational effects of historical trauma may display behaviors that look like defiance but are survival responses. Waters and colleagues in 2024 found that historical trauma from colonization and boarding school policies continues to impact Indigenous children, and Western diagnostic frameworks often miss this context entirely. We must be trauma-informed and culturally responsive in our assessments. Depression and anxiety are the most common internalizing disorders of middle childhood. About 2% experience depressive disorders. A critical clinical point, because young children often lack the maturity to say, "I feel depressed." Distress shows up as behavioral changes and declining school performance. Anxiety presents similarly, with persistent worry. Common presentations include school phobia, separation anxiety, and social phobia. For neurodivergent children, the picture is more complex. Research by Vieira and colleagues in 2024 shows that children with ADHD and autism experience higher rates of depression and anxiety. But these difficulties can be masked through diagnostic overshadowing, where clinicians attribute social withdrawal to autism rather than recognizing depression or depression-related anhedonia behind ADHD inattention. Cultural factors add another layer. In some groups, distress is expressed somatically through stomach aches and headaches. Culture-specific stressors like discrimination, language barriers, and for Indigenous communities, historical trauma, create additional risk we must account for. Now move into Part 2, Social Development. If emotional development is the internal architecture, social development is the child building their first neighborhood on the outside. They are learning the social rules, finding their place among peers, and figuring out who belongs in their world and who does not. During middle childhood, the social world expands dramatically. Children spend more time with peers and less time with parents. They develop moral reasoning, social cognition, and the ability to take others' perspectives. They navigate complex dynamics of friendship, social hierarchies, inclusion, and exclusion. We will examine each topic through cultural and neurodivergent lenses, because the social world is always culturally constructed. Children move from a punishment-avoidant morality in early childhood to an understanding of fairness, caring, justice, and intent. Kohlberg's theory describes this progression, but it has faced important critiques. Carol Gilligan argued his theory was biased because it was based on male participants and did not adequately value care-based moral reasoning alongside justice-based reasoning. More importantly, for culturally responsive counseling, Kohlberg's framework may not be universal. Research by Mohegi and colleagues in 2020 found significant limitations in applying his stages across cultural and religious contexts. Culturally diverse moral frameworks prioritize relational responsibility, reciprocity, and harmony with the natural world. In many Native communities, as Cross and colleagues described in 2023, moral teaching occurs through storytelling using animal characters to teach values. Discipline was never separate from teaching, but was an opportunity to model the right way of behaving, intertwined with spiritual beliefs. These are sophisticated moral frameworks that stage theory simply does not capture. We need to hold developmental theories loosely enough to recognize that moral development takes different paths in different cultural contexts. Social awareness includes social cognition, how children think about people and relationships, and social perspective taking, the ability to see the world from someone else's viewpoint. This is a huge developmental leap that enables empathy. A 2024 systematic review found that across 38 SEL programs in 20 countries, the vast majority focus on emotion recognition, regulation, and social decision-making, demonstrating global recognition that these skills matter. For neurodivergent children, social cognition follows different pathways. The double empathy problem challenges the old assumption that autistic children simply lack social skills. Instead, it suggests social difficulties between autistic and neurotypical individuals are bidirectional. Neurotypical individuals also struggle to understand neurodivergent perspectives. Rather than only teaching neurodivergent children to adapt to neurotypical norms, we should also help neurotypical children understand diverse ways of socializing. Peer relationships undergo a dramatic transformation in middle childhood as children increasingly orient toward peers. Peers serve as teachers of perspective-taking and emotional regulation, role models for social norms, and shapers of emerging identity. Researchers identify 4 categories of peer acceptance. Accepted children have higher self-esteem and better school performance. Rejected children are actively disliked. Neglected children are essentially invisible, and controversial children are liked by some and disliked by others. Research by Hosseini and colleagues in 2024 on Native American youth found that stronger ethnic racial identity predicted greater peer belonging, which in turn predicted higher self-esteem, reflecting collectivist worldviews in which the self is connected to community. When working with children from collectivist cultures, peer belonging may function differently. It is not just about being liked individually. It is about being connected to a collective. Social exclusion affects many children in middle childhood. 2 profiles emerge. Children who are extremely shy and anxious, becoming targets for aggressive peers, and children whose externalizing behavior disrupts group harmony, leading to rejection. Children form in-group and out-group classifications that determine inclusion and exclusion. Intersectionality is critical here. Children belonging to multiple marginalized groups face compounding exclusion risks. Autistic children may be excluded not because they lack social skills, but because norms do not accommodate diverse communication styles. A child who prefers parallel play or communicates very directly may be seen as odd, even though these are different, not deficient, ways of socializing. Racially and culturally diverse children in predominantly non-diverse schools may face exclusion based on cultural differences, such as valuing listening and observing over speaking up. As counselors, we need to help schools create environments where diverse social styles are valued, not just tolerated. Pro-social behavior includes helping, sharing, comforting, and cooperating. Altruism, a specific type, involves acts at a cost to the self, linked to empathy and theory of mind. On the other hand, we see proactive aggression, which is deliberate and goal-directed, and reactive aggression, which is impulsive and responds to perceived threats. Empathy is the bridge. Children who can take others' perspectives are far more likely to act prosocially, which is why SEL programs building empathy are so important. Culture matters here. For example, from an indigenous perspective, prosocial behavior is deeply embedded in cultural values of reciprocity, collective responsibility, and communal well-being. Interventions such as the Family Listening and Circle program developed through community-based participatory research with tribal communities, bring together children, parents, and elders to strengthen cultural connectedness and build empathy in a culturally responsive manner. It is important to center interventions and programs that honor an array of cultural values, rather than imposing Western frameworks. Bullying is repetitive, intentional hurting involving an imbalance of power. It takes many forms: physical, verbal, psychological, direct, indirect, and cyber. Boys more commonly use physical bullying, while girls tend toward relational aggression. Both bullies and victims often lack social skills and are rejected by peers. The most common victims are anxious, withdrawn children with few friends. Through an intersectional lens, neurodivergent children, particularly those with visible differences, face significantly higher bullying rates. Racial and ethnic minority children may face race-based bullying on top of general victimization. Children who do not conform to expected gender roles are especially vulnerable. As counselors in schools, our role extends beyond individual counseling. We need to advocate for systemic, school-wide prevention using MTSS frameworks. At Tier 1, create cultures valuing diversity and inclusion. At Tier 2, provide targeted group interventions for at-risk students. At Tier 3, offer intensive support to those who are chronically affected by bullying. Sports and screen time are two major social influences in middle childhood. Sports offer benefits in communication, cooperation, and self-esteem, but can also involve excessive pressure and exclusion of less athletic children. Many communities value collaborative physical activities over competitive sports. Screen time presents a complex picture. Research shows a correlation between aggressive media content and aggressive behavior, and excessive screen time is linked to less sleep and outdoor play. The media also shape cultural identity. Children from underrepresented groups may rarely see positive self-representation, which can impact self-concept. For Indigenous children, the media has historically relied on harmful stereotypes. We should also consider the digital divide. While discussions often focus on too much technology, children in rural, Indigenous, and low-income communities may lack adequate access, creating its own disadvantages. A balanced, culturally informed perspective considers both access and content quality. Families remain the foundation of social-emotional development, even as children orient toward peers. Authoritative parenting, warmth combined with structure, is consistently associated with the best outcomes. But this distinction was developed within a Western framework. What researchers label authoritarian may look different in a cultural context. African American, Asian American, and Mexican American families are more likely to use approaches categorized as authoritarian. But within these communities, such approaches often serve protective functions, helping children navigate discrimination or danger. For Indigenous communities, Waters and colleagues in 2024 challenged the application of Western attachment theory, noting its exclusive focus on the parent-child dyad. In many Indigenous communities, the caregiving bond extends to the entire community. Children are raised by extended family, elders, and community members. Storytelling teaches values and emotional regulation. But the devastating history of boarding school policies forcibly separated children from these networks, with intergenerational impacts still felt today. Understanding this history is essential to culturally responsive practice. Understanding how children cope with stress is essential for clinical work. 3 primary strategies emerge in middle childhood: problem-solving, distraction, and support-seeking. These are shaped by both development and culture. Children of color and children of immigrants may face unique stressors, including discrimination and navigating between cultural worlds. Research by Nguyen and Bennett Martinez suggests that developing a bicultural identity can itself be a powerful coping strategy. For Indigenous children, cultural engagement is particularly important. In 2023, John Henderson and White found that communal mastery, a sense of shared efficacy rooted in collectivist values, was associated with better emotional outcomes under stress. This is fundamentally different from the individual mastery emphasized in Western psychology. Women with high communal mastery experienced less depressive mood under stress. Resilience here is not an individual trait, but a collective resource. Cultural identity, language, and connection to land serve as protective factors that build resilience even amid historical trauma and racism. Let me distill the key clinical implications. First, practice cultural humility. Ask families about their values, rather than assuming universal frameworks apply. Second, adopt neurodiversity-affirming practices. Help neurodivergent children develop self-understanding that includes strengths, and avoid pathologizing different but valid communication and regulation styles. Third, think systemically with MTSS. Advocate for school-wide changes at Tier 1 before focusing only on individual intervention at Tier 3. Fourth, consider historical and intergenerational trauma. Some children carry the weight of trauma spanning generations, and Western diagnostic frameworks may miss this context. Finally, leverage cultural strengths. Cultural identity, collectivist values, bilingualism, and community connectedness are protective factors. Build on what families already bring. This is not just good cultural practice, it is good clinical practice. Here are the references for this presentation. These include foundational texts, current research on Indigenous perspectives, cross-cultural coping, and neurodivergent social-emotional development. I encourage you to explore these sources to deepen your understanding. These are additional references, including recent research on emotion regulation in neurodivergent populations and Indigenous perspectives on the child-caregiver bond. I want to leave you with this central message. Development is always cultural, always contextual, and always individual. There is no such thing as a culturally neutral child. Every child develops within a specific constellation of culture, neurology, family, community, and lived experience. As counselors, our task is not to measure children against a single developmental yardstick, but to understand each child within their unique context. The theories we have studied, Erikson, Kohlberg, Harter, and others, give us useful frameworks, but they are lenses, not mirrors. They illuminate certain aspects while leaving others in shadow. Our job is to hold multiple lenses simultaneously, bringing cultural, cross-cultural, neurodivergent, and systemic perspectives to see each child fully. Thank you for your engagement with this material. I welcome your questions and discussion.